Okay, so are you ready to dive into a question that's probably like crossed all of our minds at some point? You know, that whole like, was the universe created perfect thing?
Hmm.
So today we are unpacking some excerpts from Resolving Genesis. And let me tell you, this author is not afraid to shake things up a bit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, right out of the gate they ask, what if the Earth, the universe, what if none of it was actually created perfect?
That's a very interesting approach, especially because, the author dives right into how we often interpret that phrase, God called his creation good, as synonymous with absolute perfection.
Right. Like good automatically equals perfect end of story.
Yeah,
But the author is urging us to like hit pause on that assumption.
exactly. They make this distinction between something being sinless and something being perfect,
Yeah.
and that's where things start to get really thought-provoking.
So walk me through this sinless versus perfect idea. What's the difference and like why does it even matter?
It's a subtle difference, but really significant. Think about it this way. You can bake an absolutely incredible cake, follow the recipe perfectly. It tastes amazing, but is it perfect in every sense of the word?
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Hmm.
Unless that cake solves world hunger, it's probably not hitting every mark of perfection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the idea of relative perfection the author is getting at. That cake might be a perfect cake, but it doesn't suddenly embody every facet of perfection imaginable.
So how does this relate back to the universe not being perfect?
That's where the author points to some really compelling examples, even going all the way back to Genesis 3.16, where God tells Eve he'll increase her pain in childbirth.
Now that's always been a tough one to fully unpack.
It is, but it actually reveals something pretty crucial to this whole idea of initial perfection. The fact that pain is being increased suggests it was already present in some form, challenging this idea of a completely painless and therefore perfect pre-fall existence.
It's true, if everything was already perfect, why would anything need to become more intense or difficult?
Precisely. And the author then takes us to Isaiah, which is where this idea of differing standards of perfection is amplified even further. Isaiah 55.7-9 describes God's ways and thoughts as being higher than the heavens are above the earth.
And we're talking about a universe that spans, what is it, 93 billion light years? Makes you feel pretty small, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
Even with all of our scientific understanding, the vastness of the universe is almost impossible to truly grasp. And God's ways are being described as exceeding even that immensity.
So if we're using the universe as a measuring stick,
It shows us that our human understanding of perfection is incredibly limited compared to God's.
yeah, it's almost like we need a new word entirely because our definition just falls short.
I think you're onto something.
Yeah.
And if that wasn't enough to challenge our perceptions, the author brings up the seraphim in Isaiah chapter 6.
Okay, now we're getting into some powerful imagery. I'm picturing something out of an epic fantasy novel.
Right. These celestial beings are in constant praise of God. But here's where it gets interesting. Even these seraphims, who are sinless beings, can't look directly upon God. They cover themselves because his glory is too overwhelming.
Wow, so even sinlessness being completely free from sin isn't enough to handle the fullness of whatever we're calling this divine perfection?
It's an incredibly powerful image, and the author connects it to a pivotal moment in the New Testament. Jesus washing the disciples' feet in John 13.
You mean that ultimate act of service and humility?
Yes, feet in this context symbolize our conduct before God. The author points out that even these outwardly perfect actions, the seraphim's constant praise, Jesus washing feet, aren't the root of true righteousness. It has to come from something deeper.
So if even these like incredible examples of perfect actions don't tell the whole story, what Sato does, like what is this other kind of perfection the author keeps hinting at?
That's where we kind of shift gears from looking at the initial state of creation to something much grander, the ultimate perfection of God's children through Jesus.
Okay, so we're talking about the kind of perfection made possible through Christ's sacrifice. What does the author have to say about that?
Well, they bring in a few different verses from Hebrews that really paint a clear picture. Like Hebrews 10.1, which talks about how even the law, with all its rules and rituals, couldn't actually make anyone perfect.
It's like the law was pointing toward the true perfection that Jesus would ultimately bring.
Exactly. And the author highlights Hebrews 10.14 and 12.2, which both emphasize that it's Jesus' sacrifice, that single act, that makes it possible for believers to be made perfect.
It's like this incredible reset button, wiping the slate clean and making true perfection possible.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop there. Hebrews 12.23 actually talks about the spirits of the righteous being made perfect. This isn't just some abstract concept. It has real eternal implications.
This is blowing my mind a little bit.
Okay,
So we have these sinless seraphim who still can't stand completely exposed before God.
but through Christ, we as redeemed humans will ultimately be able to experience that total communion with God.
Wow, that changes everything about how I've always pictured perfection. But we're not done yet, are we? The author also brings up this whole idea of a new heaven and new earth.
Right, this is where the author starts to connect these concepts to a future reality. 2 Peter 3.13 talks about this new creation, a place where righteousness dwells.
So not just a touched-up version of what we have now, but something completely new.
That seems to be the case. And even though the Bible doesn't lay out every single detail, this future state, completely free from sin, could give us a glimpse into what the world was like before the fall.
You mean righteous, but maybe not perfect in that idealized way we often envision?
It's definitely a possibility the author presents, and it brings up some fascinating questions. For example, why would God use words like subdue and rule in Genesis 1.28 if the world was already perfect?
That's a really good point. Those aren't words I'd use to describe a perfectly harmonious paradise. Subdue implies some kind of resistance and obstacle to overcome.
Precisely. It suggests a more dynamic relationship between humanity and creation than we usually picture.
Kind of like if I have to subdue my inbox, it means I have my work cut out for me. It's not just going to magically take care of itself.
Exactly. And it circles back to that idea we discussed earlier, this concept of God's plan for us, for our growth and transformation.
So instead of a static, picture-perfect creation from the very beginning, it's less about like a snapshot of perfection and more about this unfolding story, this journey.
Yeah, and that process inevitably involves challenges and imperfections along the way. The author even points out that Adam and Eve had access to the tree of life before the fall.
Oh, right. It's in Genesis 3.22 where God prevents them from eating from it after they sin.
Exactly. It makes you wonder about the nature of life and death in that pre-fall world. If they already had access to something that sustained life before sin, maybe things weren't quite as static as we often imagine.
It really throws a wrench into the traditional way of thinking about it, and then the author brings it full circle by mentioning how the tree of life pops up again in Revelation in the new heaven and new earth.
Yeah, it's like this beautiful picture of restoration and renewal, but it also reinforces that even in a perfect world, God's grace is the ultimate source of life. What strikes me about all of this is how it challenges us to look beyond very surface-level understanding of what perfect means, especially when we're talking about God.
It's true. This entire deep dive has been eye-opening. I feel like I've had some assumptions challenged that I didn't even realize I was carrying around about creation and perfection.
That's the beauty of really wrestling with these ideas. It's not about having all the answers. It's about broadening our perspective and sparking new questions.
So where does all of this leave us? What would you say is the main takeaway for our listeners?
I think it comes down to this. What if instead of chasing after this unattainable, static idea of perfection, we embrace the beauty of growth and transformation? This journey we're all on that's made possible by grace, not by our own attempts to be good enough.
It's like trading this rigid, impossible standard for something so much more expansive and hopeful. It's not about being perfect from day one. It's about becoming who we were always meant to be through the transformative power of Christ.
And with that in mind, I'll leave your listeners with this question. Could this new perspective, this understanding of perfection as an ongoing journey, change how you view your own imperfections, the imperfections of the world around you? And ultimately, how might it shape the way you see the boundless grace that makes true redemption possible?
Lots to think about, for sure. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
Introducing a new book with 3 new old Earth theories that comes closer to any of the previous theories in resolving Genesis. These theories allow for a literal, logical narrative that agrees with science. They also link to real-world events in Earth's recent history. Find out how in this new book, available on Amazon.com now. On Amazon, search for Resolving Genesis.